delighted here to be able to present findings from a comparative project that we've had on the go for the better part of 2 years. And just to provide a little bit of background on this, I think each of us comes at this from a very different angle, but very much the inspiration for this project is my dear friend and colleague, David Last, who's spent 20 years, and ever since he came to RMC, got me thinking about professional military education, and who's traveled to more places and probably studied more institutions than many of us here present this morning combined. And so the broader interest in professional military education, but then also realizing that while we do lots of work on staff colleges and curriculums and structures of staff colleges, we actually do very little work on the pre-commissioning institutions. And those institutions have become critical, in particular in many democracies where we're struggling with recruitment at times of military cadets, where students are looking for a premier education, where students have more choices in the university landscape, in the university programs than ever before, and where we also, of course, work in a defense environment that is more complex and more challenging for students than it has ever been. And so what we provide at that level is ever more critical for the institutions, because these are the skill sets that the people will take away as officers to navigate this very complex security environment, oftentimes heavily fiscally restrained, challenging political situations, both domestically and internationally. And so, and the institutions themselves, given the fiscal constraints, have come under a lot of scrutiny. What is the value added of having these military universities, often smaller schools that have fewer students, highly specialized in their programming and in the expertise of some of the profs? And so trying to understand more about the value added that institutions provide, the knowledge that they are able to build in terms of a body of knowledge and disseminate, but also, as David would be the first one to point out, the importance of the knowledge that they generate, the knowledge that they mobilize, that they curate, that they transfer, and that they transfer much more broadly than simply to cadets. So the expertise that we have in terms of research, in terms of professors, that doesn't exist in any civilian universities, in particular with many civilian universities turning their attention away from issues of security, intelligence, defense. And so I think the space is changing dramatically. And as Officer Cadet Turmel will present to us in some of the comparative findings, there's some very clear shifts over the last 25 years in patterns that emerge from institutions where they've actually been given more tasks and are doing more things, more complex things at a higher level, which clearly shows that more than ever before, officers are, and officers and all the members in uniform are the most important assets that our armed forces organizations have, and the critical role that our pre-commissioned military universities play here. So we'll go in the order of having Professor Coombs present first, on a case study, RMC as a case study. All the studies follow roughly the same structure so that we actually have comparative elements where we can identify patterns. We will then have Monsieur Turmel identify some of the comparative elements, and then Professor Last providing some context for sort of the broader conversation. This is a project that's being underwritten by the class of 1965 at RMC that has a keen interest in promoting learning and education, especially among officer cadets, and it will give rise to a book that I hope will be out by about this time next fall. So Professor Coombs, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, so give me a moment. David or Christian, can you see in that and hear me fine? Perfect. All right, before I start, I would actually like to take a moment to thank the organizers of this conference. There's a number of them involved who are involved with the panel and spectating today. And I would like to say that after having been involved with conferences over the years, I found the virtual conferences of the pandemics to take a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of energy. So I congratulate you all for the work that you've done, and I thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'd also like to acknowledge the role of the informal facilitators like Kareem El-Baz, who I'm glad to see is online today, who's a war studies student, and to thank Tom Turmel for being here today to do the commentary. So I'm going to discuss, as Professor Leuprecht spoke about, a comparative chapter that I wrote on RMC, and it's been a long time in the making. The chapters of the discussion, without taking away from anybody's comments, have been very interesting. They have used all kinds of sources and data to try to create the comparative aspects that Professor Leuprecht was hoping to achieve. And it has been a very interesting project. What you are going to see in the next one was a snapshot of just a part of a 9,000 word chapter. And I hope that it captures the essence of what makes RMC a university with a difference. The Royal Military College of Canada, commonly abbreviated as RMC, is one of two military colleges of the Canadian Armed Forces, and since 1959, a degree-granting university, which educates military officers. RMC was established in 1874 and is at this time the only federal institution in Canada with full degree-granting powers in arts, science, and engineering, which are offered at undergraduate and graduate levels, both on campus as well as through the college's distance learning programs. It is a small university with over 1,000 full-time students and a similar number of part-time students and about 200 faculty. RMC's sister institution, the Royal Military College Saint-Jean, was founded in 1952, but was closed in 1995 and reopened again in 2008, with all its students finishing the last years of the program at RMC. However, in 2018, the Royal Military College Saint-Jean University Charter was reinstated, and the first class graduated in May 2021 with undergraduate credentials in international relations, currently the sole degree program offered. At this time, there are many Royal Military College Saint-Jean students moving to RMC to complete degrees other than a Baccalaureate of International Relations. RMC offers a selection of undergraduate, graduate, and non-degree programs to aspiring officers, serving members of the military, civil servants, and a small number of civilians. However, the education offered to officer candidates under the Regular Officer Training Program, or ROTP, is the core of the college's efforts. This plan provides a chance to acquire an undergraduate degree and an officer's commission in the Canadian Armed Forces at RMC. While ROTP, Regular Officer Training Program, is not the sole source of entry-level officers in the Canadian military, it does provide approximately 1/3 of the officer intake for the Canadian Armed Forces. Consequently, RMC is a significant participant in the Canadian Armed Forces officer generation system and continually adapts its programming to produce officers that can meet the institutional and operational requirements of the Canadian Armed Forces. Located at Point Frederick Peninsula in Kingston, Ontario, the college is a mix of historic buildings and more modern academic, athletic, and dormitory facilities. Officer cadets of the Royal Military College are trained in what are known as the 4 pillars of academics, military, athletics, and bilingualism. These 4 pillars reflect RMC's efforts to consistently evolve in a way that remains relevant to the needs of Canadian defense and security. Academics. Officer cadets are required to complete a degree program as part of the ROTP. Included in all degree programs is a core curriculum component identified as essential to the development of junior leaders as critical thinkers. Successful completion of the core requirement and undergraduate degree is required to successfully graduate from RMC. This core component across arts and sciences composes about 1/3 of a 4-year program. Military. The ROTP program has a military component consisting of general military knowledge, personal attributes, teamwork, leadership, communications, and ceremonial activities. These are accomplished over the 4 years at RMC through classes, self-study, leadership assignments, and mentoring. During this process, officer cadets are assigned leadership positions to provide them with an opportunity to develop their leadership techniques. Most formal military training courses, except for basic training, normally takes place after graduation. Bilingualism. The Canadian Armed Forces mandates a bilingual officer course, and RMC, ROTP, includes a second language training program designed to take either an Anglophone or Francophone officer cadet from no second language capability to a bilingual level. The program in past years has averaged a 97% success rate. Physical fitness. The fourth pillar of the RMC ROTP, regular officer training program, is physical fitness. Cadets not only take physical fitness classes, but are tested to a high physical fitness standard. Additionally, all cadets are required to take part in an intramural sports program conducted throughout the academic year, or participate in one of the varsity level sports teams or competitive clubs. On top of academic programs, RMC offers professional military education to members of the CAF, Canadian Armed Forces, other than ROTP students, as well as technical capability to the Government of Canada. RMC provides a range of short technical education courses and assists technical inquiries and related research of operational importance to the Canadian Armed Forces. This focused technical education includes cybersecurity and electronic warfare programs. Other longer technical programs of about 1 year include the Army Technical Warrant Officer Program and the Army Technical Staff Officer courses, as well as ammunition engineering and aircraft structure. There are also other year-long defense-related programs such as the Aboriginal Leadership Opportunity Year. This program offers education and military opportunities to young Aboriginal Canadians without any obligation for military service beyond the program year. Another long program is the Non-Commissioned Member Executive Professional Development Program, which gives Chief Warrant Officers and Chief Petty Officers, first class, the opportunity to complete undergraduate courses that may assist with their future career paths. Considered not only a federal university, but also a unit of Canadian Armed Forces, RMC is structured to accommodate that dualism. It is directed by a commanding officer appointed as the commandant, normally a Commodore, Navy, or a Brigadier General. The principal is a civilian, and a government appointment is next in precedence to the commandant, except for military command authority. In addition, the principal, due to the nature of his government appointment, has direct access to the Minister of National Defense. The college is organized into primary divisions or wings based on academic training, support service, and corporate functions. The principal directs the academic wing that is divided into faculties, engineering, science, social sciences, and humanities, and divisions like graduate studies. Each is managed by a dean. The deans manage their departments and programs. Further, there is a vice principal for research and another for academics. College research efforts, which are discussed later, are supported by the vice principal for research. Plus, there is also a registrar with a supporting staff who reports to the vice principal for academics. The registrar's office fulfills the educational administration functions necessary for the institution. The academic wing delivers the academic program and includes full-time civilian faculty, military faculty, sessional instructors, contract researchers, and other staff. The training wing, in which the officer cadets are located, the cadet wing, is led by the director of cadets. This captain navy or colonel is responsible to the commandant for activities of the wing. The training wing includes officers, non-commissioned members, and civilian staff who interact with and support the cadet wing. The cadet wing is, the cadet wing is structured into divisions and squadrons. The military officers and non-commissioned members of the training wing advise and appraise the officer cadets of the cadet wing. Officer cadets within the cadet wing are appointed into positions in the cadet chain of responsibility, which works with the training wing staff to oversee the administration and functioning of the cadet wing. The cadet chain of responsibility has a cadet leadership responsible to the training wing at each corresponding organization, wing, division, and squadron. General support of all types, administrative, financial, and disciplinary, is provided by the supporting organizations led by directors and synchronized by the Deputy Commander / Chief of Staff, a Captain Navy or Colonel. This Deputy Commandant / Chief of Staff is responsible for day-to-day management and coordination of supporting activities across all wings with his or her subordinate directors, as shown on this slide. In addition to supporting educational activities, faculty members of RMC are solicited in various national and international fora to present papers, lectures as experts in their fields. Additionally, they produce a great deal of both peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed publications. Research activities at RMC take many forms other than publication. First, RMC has a Slowpoke 2 facility, which provides for Department of National Defense nuclear educational, research, and operational requirements. Second, the Center for Space Research supports space research programs and activities, including space science and other space-related degree programs. Third, the Environmental Sciences Group is one of a kind, internationally acknowledged, a cross-specialized group that brings to bear scientific expertise in the management of contaminated sites. Fourth, RMC is a co-founder of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research, which is now a network of 1,700 researchers, 43 Canadian universities, and 10 international affiliates. This research group examines the health research needs of military members, veterans, and their families. Fifth, RMC has a computer security laboratory, which is a leading research organization for cybersecurity and computer matters. Sixth, RMC is part of the National Canada Research Chairs program. Created in 2000, this government program endowed 2,000 Canadian research chairs in about 80 universities with about $265 million annually. That's a house payment and a half, to recruit and retain gifted scholars. RMC has 5 Canada Research Chairs, which is significant in and of itself. Finally, RMC faculty are active in international and national academic societies and support scholarly competitions. RMC is Canada's first fully funded federal university, and its uniqueness is also further enhanced by its being part of the Department of Defense professional military education system. Resultantly, RMC is essential to the continued vitality and sustainability of the Canadian Armed Forces. As a university with intellectual ties to defense priorities, the college directly contributes to these security objectives by providing its students with a broad-based education in humanities, sciences, and engineering. The interdisciplinary nature of the core curriculum within the ROTP, Regular Officer Training Program, undergraduate degrees, provides the Canadian military with the abilities needed to serve and operate in complex and opaque environments. It gives future junior officers education in a variety of fields with an emphasis on critical thinking, technical expertise, and leadership. Furthermore, on-site and distance learning programs benefit the entire defense team, on top of producing graduates that contribute nationally and internationally. RMC faculty use world-class research to enable this process and, for a small university, have established an international reputation in their fields. This is evidenced by the Canada Research Chair Program and other activities in which RMC professors are engaged. In its continual efforts to adapt and evolve to meet the institutional defense and security needs of the 21st century, RMC has truly earned the sobriquet, a university with a difference. I appreciate everybody's attention, and I hand it off to the next speaker.
So since Howard needs to leave us in 10 minutes for another meeting, I'll provide an opportunity for Q&A for what Howard has provided. While people think about that, let me just make a couple of observations. Howard is the prime example of the sort of person I was able to find to write about the 9 other institutions for a total of 10 for this study. It's actually extremely difficult, although it's what Howard presented sounds so straightforward. Finding somebody who has a holistic appreciation of the institution and who knows where to find the data, which actually turned out to be fantastically challenging, not just in Canada, but for all the studies. And these are people who are already on the inside and understand the institution. I think so. So what we get here is, I think, exactly the sort of civil military persona of somebody who has the military experience and who has the academic credentials and who knows their institution. And so those characteristics prove to be much more challenging to find than I'd anticipated. The other studies are all countries that are roughly sort of within Canada's size and remit. I'll talk about that in a moment, with the exception of the United States. So what we're trying to contribute here is also access to an understanding of institutions that I think are very poorly understood, including by the people who work for them and teach them, let alone people who are outside and trying to make sense of them. So trying to demystify it and provide some baseline for some data. And I think David will talk about the subsequent, because it's actually very difficult to do good comparative empirical research when you don't have any data to start with. And especially on institutions like RMC, the sunk costs are extremely high for people to get into this type of work. And each of the contributions to this project, I don't know, Howard, you can probably tell me, but we're probably on version 4, 5, 6 or so of the study.
Actually, you will laugh, but with the recent restructure to some of the sub institutions of RMC, I have to do rewrites of parts of the chapter to make it up to date.
So it's been very much a collective effort and sort of a significant challenge to, I think, align these chapters and to get them also that to provide the sort of narrative that is accessible and useful both to professionals and experts and to the general public. And so Howard's patience is also indicative of the patience that all the authors have had with me, and coming back to them repeatedly on, can we do a little bit more there, and can we do a little bit more here, and them themselves having gotten extensive peer review on their pieces internally. So in all the cases, this was very much a collective effort by people to contribute, and it turned out to be a much taller order to operationalize, both conceptually and in terms of actually rolling it out and finding the people, getting them to the contributions to the level that I'd hoped for than I could have ever anticipated. But I'm very excited about doing this because there's really nothing like it out there. And I hope that it provides both an inspiration for some of our other colleagues and also opportunity to hopefully continue to expand this and make this a more systematic opportunity to compare our institutions and to be able to learn from one another, which is, I think, the ultimate objective here. David, do you what's the best way to facilitate any Q&A from the audience before Howard has to leave us here?
People can put their hands up, and you can call on people for their questions, and Howard can answer them. So it works just like a regular room. So I have a question, Howard, because I'd like to ask all of the authors this, having looked at all of their chapters now. Where did you have to go to find the data? And what are some of the challenges in putting together the numbers? Because we've got some on the call, in the room. We've got people involved in curation, librarians. We've got the principal. How do we at RMC keep our data? And where did you go to find it?
Well, now that's a great question. And I'm certainly not glad you asked that. Firstly, there's no centralized repository of an overarching data collection for RMC spanning a number of years. And in fact, our data collection efforts are becoming more coherent, but they've only really started for those non-Canadians in the room, we had a federal audit a number of years ago. So our data collection efforts have been under the tutelage of the current administration at the college, and we have really just started to gather data. So we don't really have an empirical base of data that spans back enough years to be able to do comparative analyses. So that being said, there are bits and pieces of data out there, but they are not, as I mentioned, sitting in a central repository where you can access it. So how did I gather the data for the RMC case study? Well, internally within the college, there was the registrar's office holds statistics on certain, not all aspects of registrations, but certain aspects of registration that span maybe a decade in some cases, maybe not in others. The Canadian Forces recruiting group were generous in some ways because they could help me with aspects of the data of intakes. The registrar helped me with outtakes, for example. The Canadian Forces Director General Research, what's that abbreviation again, David? Director General?
Military Personnel Research and Analysis, DGMPRA.
DGMPRA. So quite a mouthful, and I have friends and colleagues up there, so I contacted them, and they frankly admitted they had very little on RMC or very little rigorous analysis. Dr. Cole, who is, I think, online still, he hasn't taken off in disgust. He asked for a look at GOFOs, general officers, flag officers who are RMC graduates, and in terms of long-term implications, they had that study, but nothing else that they could provide me at that time. Then I worked through an old friend at the Canadian Forces College, and thanks Murphy, it's the Kathy Murphy for being online. He touched base with the Information Research Center, and from what he had, so Al Okras, who had some networks as well, so he gathered pieces together as well. Then I also generalized other data points by doing internet surfing through StatsCan and gathering scholarly studies that had been done to aspects of EDI, for example, gender studies that have been done in Canada to touch on the military, and been able to put that together. So as you can tell from just that wide-ranging discussion, which really doesn't even encapsulate the fulsome spread that I had to do for data gathering, it was a very interesting, and at times I will say frustrating experience to try to knit together the data points. But it does indicate that as we move forward, we have to do a better job at collecting our own data, because without this data, it simply becomes a debate as to who is right and who is wrong. And subject to great, and the data that I did put together is, I'm an arts guy. I tried calculus 3 times before I got through it. So the data I got through is very basic and is subject to interpretation. So I see it one way, but somebody else, because of the methods by which I had to use to gather and put together, may perceive it another. So long-winded response, David, but you can tell it was quite a challenging effort.
Would you mind if I chimed in here? Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can, Harry.
Good. Sorry about that. Doing a mic check there. So thank you so much, Howard, for putting this together and sharing our story and the challenges to gathering some of the data. Having gone through the Auditor General report and trying to explain RMC 101 to our auditors was difficult. And I would take the conversation just a little broader in terms of sharing the story and who should be sharing our story. When you talked about DGMPRA, who is doing a study, an objective study, those are the kind of folks who you want to be doing an analysis into your organization, including the Auditor Generals, because as part of the organization, I found that any time that I shared the story, I was looked on as being biased, and rightfully so. I'm the principal of RMC, so I'm going to share the good news story, and I'm going to tell all the great stuff that we're doing. So the conversation that we're having is to try to identify who is it out there who should be taking a look at our value added, our product, and so we're having these conversations with our higher headquarters. Somebody who's at least one step removed from RMC, who can objectively take a look at the data, take a look at the metrics, and tell us what we're doing well, but also identify some of the warts so that we can do better. Anyway, those are my comments. But all this to say, Howard, you did a great job. Thanks for your presentation. Cheers.
And now it's Howard has to go. So Howard, I thank you for your intervention. If there's anything you want to come back with, this is a go ahead, Howard.
Thanks, and I'm delighted to see Principal Cole on the line because I'm going to send my final version to him, the penultimate version, to see if you have time to comment on it.
Thank you, Howard.
All right, bye everyone. Off to the next meeting.
And the remarks by Principal Cole are, I think, are broadly representative of the challenges that we faced across countries, because I went into this assuming I have sort of a good idea of like all the metrics that I wanted to collect because of the work that David Last had done. And it's kind of like, well, we'll just go out and we collect it. And it turns out that you can't collect these metrics because they aren't available anywhere. Even the people who work for the institutions, in many cases, it was exactly this sort of hunt chasing down various rabbit holes, even just to figure out where are possible data that might sort of be comparable on some of these elements. So I think one of the efforts here is that we're actually building a comparative baseline for data. And if nothing else, this project, for me at least, was very cathartic, because all the things that we think that we're the only institution that has these challenges, it turns out that everyone else has the same challenges or bigger challenges, or they just kind of vary in terms of nuance. And so I hope that we can also add a whole lot to sort of a broader perspective of trying to understand what we do, why we do it, how we do it, where we're doing well, where we can excel. But I think this is a good opportunity to segue to Officer Cadet Turmel, because a lot of what you heard from Howard might sound on the surface of it a bit arcane and descriptive, but it turns out that there's only so many ways you can organize an institution. It's not an infinite number of ways you can put this puzzle together. And there are very important trade-offs involved in how you put those pieces together. And so depending on what you want to achieve, given that we always in the military like to talk about strategy and we always like to talk about what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it, but we kind of have these institutions that sort of have been doing their own thing for a couple of 100 years, and sort of we assume we'll just kind of be puttering along. And I think hopefully this project will also help us to have more of a conversation about, well, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve, and what are the optimal structures and the trade-offs involved in those achievements? And so what is that we might want to keep? What is that we might want to transform? What is that we might want to do differently? And so the comparisons are really allow us to get us at some of that more of a profound conversation about those ultimate ends of the institution and how we can achieve those ends. So I should mention sort of the 10 countries involved in the study: the United States, Canada, Korea, Japan, South Africa. I wanted to make sure we didn't just have NATO member countries. Romania, Spain, Germany, and Portugal. Did I miss someone? Turkey, yes. So Turkey is the last. So you can see that there's an array of countries, but all of them sort of, with the exception of the US, sort of roughly similar somewhat similar in size and their contributions. So not super big, but also not sort of too small. So we have some comparability. And of course, I figured we couldn't do this sort of project without also involving, if we're going to write about cadets, then we should also have at least one cadet involved in the project. And Monsieur Turmel, I think it was a bit of a steep learning curve initially, and I appreciate your dedication to the project and the immense value added that you have brought to it. So what Monsieur Turmel will be talking about will become part of the introductory comparative chapters. So Monsieur Turmel, je vous en prie.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Thomas Turmel, a student at RMC and Professor Leuprecht's research assistant for this project. So basically, Professor Coombs has talked a lot about the micro on RMC. What is RMC? What does it do? What's its history? And I'll take a completely different opposite. You'll see I'll go really macro, and I'll be focusing on about a dozen trends that have transpired from the different chapters, and just how really they interact with one another. And really my objective here will be to identify both trends and then anomalies within this trend and try to explain them summarily. So Professor Leuprecht has briefly mentioned, where the data I'll be mentioning will be coming from. Some countries might not be included in the data because for logistics reasons, but the academies that will be presented in the tables and graphs to come are from the United States Military Academy, often known as West Point, Roundtable College of Canada, the Bundeswehr University in both München and Hamburg, the Korean Military Academy, the Military Higher Education from Portugal, and then the academy both in South Africa and Japan. So you can see that there's really a broad range of geographical contexts that really, I think, bring a diversity in perspective and challenges that is both interesting and challenging to research. So really start with basics. So what is the final result? What is the objective? What do military academies try to achieve? So very broadly, what is the formation that they try to do? So you can see that it's all at least bachelor's degree level education. So there is no Sandhurst model where it's a year-long, fairly short, not so academic training model. So it's at least 3 years and up to 5 years. And so that really, I think, highlights the importance of university education for officers. So the picture I had, the painting I had on the first page was that of Waterloo. And I think this is really a central point in where the education of officers develop and sort of the development of artillery and engineering, how officers now need to have technical knowledge. And as time went on, also a moral compass. And so it's interesting that the two outliers in this case are both the German and the Portuguese, because they have their students complete both a bachelor's and master's degree in a time only longer than the 4 years, for instance, afforded RMC to complete a bachelor's degree. And so that is explained by the fact that these institutions, at least for the German one, they have students complete academic semesters over the summer, whereas in some other colleges, these are dedicated to my training. So you can see that the institution, although all of them put emphasis on critical skills and practical skills for engineering degrees, especially some of them put more emphasis on education than on for military training. And the fact that, as I mentioned, there's no Sandhurst type model here really highlights the fact that there needs to be, for these institutions, deep learning for officers. So they accept that the learning curve and the time it'll take to train an officer is considerably longer than for non-commissioned members that might take a year and a half for some specialist, right? So you can really see that there's a balance that is struck here. Another thing that is fairly basic is, well, what about the population? Professor Leuprecht mentioned a few times that most countries were in the same ballpark in terms of population and size and military budget. I think that is well reflected in the number of students. You can see at the bottom the United States Military Academy, which sports 4,000 students and only one of, I think, 5 service academies in the United States. So you can see that there is, in general, about 1,500 students in average, I would say, between our institution. But that is, even the largest, USAMA, is significantly smaller than large civilian universities that can have tens of thousands of students, 30, 40,000, that's not unheard of. And so you can see that highlights the fact that military academies are niche institutions that are aimed at a specific purpose that obviously restricts the number of students that can attend, and in most regards that should attend to meet the military's need. And so another metric that I found most interesting and that I can understand was really hard to collect for the researchers is the attrition rate over the course of the program. So whether it be 3 years in case of South Africa, 4 or 5, you can see that all the attrition rate over the course of the program is at least 20%, which was very surprising to me. Because perhaps as an officer cadet you don't see it directly, but I can imagine now that I look back that there's quite an attrition rate that people leave for multitude of reasons. And I think that ties back to something Professor Coombs mentioned in his presentation, sort of the ideas of pillars, the different requirements that are expected of cadets. So it's not only a university, you're not only there to study. Often there's physical fitness requirement, there is language requirements, there is sort of a military discipline requirement. And so I can really see how these things compound to create what is, in essence, an attrition rate that would believe to be higher than at a civilian university, which is 20%, which I found quite quite high, and this also speaks to the fact that this is a challenge for all military colleges. Attrition rate, sort of getting people in the door, spending resources on them, and then not having them complete the training and become officers is really a challenge that is shared by all the participants in the study. So the next area I really want to highlight that is most interesting to me is sort of academic research. So at the end of it, is a military college a training institution for officers, which has a mission to take people that are untrained and make them into commissioned officers? Or is it a university where one of the tasks is to generate knowledge on some areas in defense and security, for instance? So how is this balance struck, and is there a balance, or are some of the universities, some of the military colleges that we've looked at simply take students and train them without the research part? So it's really whether or not some are research universities or not. And it seems to be that there is, to a large extent, at least in North America, because determining the number of peer-reviewed publication is really difficult because professors are often involved in different things. But there is, in any case, an emphasis on research. So it seems that military academies have transferred from only being about training officers to being about being normal universities with a different, perhaps, as Professor Coombs framed it. But there's really an emphasis on research. And so the other thing that was interesting to me is there was all universities have academic freedom, so the ability to express opinions that could be contrary to what the military would want to be said, so opposing some decisions taken by the government. This is something that is common to every chapters we have, but also some of them are more encouraged to focus on subject relevant to the study or related to it, not to the study, sorry, but to the military. So defense, security are themes that really come back often and often. And in a few institutions, RMC and USAMA being some, although they're not set in concrete, certain professors are expected to publish a certain number of publications. So you can see maybe that the emphasis put on research is at different levels in different institutions. And so now we come to something that was really important for Professor Leuprecht, and I think which is one of the strong points of their study so far, is comparing who attends military institutions around the world. When Professor Coombs was talking about data that was difficult to come by, I imagine this is one of these. So understanding what are the demographics around the world and how are they different from one another. And so here we're looking at women, which are a group that have historically been excluded from the military in general, and especially military colleges. But it seems that there's a trend in the last 25 years that the number has steadily increased. And the first years in which women were accepted in military academies is often the 1970s and 1980s. So you can see that this is really a trend going up. And so if you look at the percentage of women in corps of cadets in the different institutions, it averages sometimes 25% in North America, lower in Asian countries, but it seems that the trend is going upwards, but it's in no way representative of the share of women in population, besides for the South African Military Academy, which are at 45%, which is almost representative of their population, where women sit at 50%. And so it's really interesting to see how through inclusion of women through different campaigns to get them involved, they've really been able to push that to really bring that number almost to parity with how men attend the institution. And then another factor that was interesting for me is how in certain countries, so the National Defense Academy of Japan and the Korean Military Academy, have a set number of students from both sexes, so both male and female. And so that makes it so the percentage is not based on applicants, it's based on what the institution has set, the standards they've set. And so one of the consequences of that is that entering one of these two institutions as a woman is significantly harder, I think 3 or 4 times harder than a male, simply because the quotas that are set or changing the balance. And so you can really see that there's different approaches towards the inclusion of women here. And so very interesting, these data are extremely hard to come by, and these are really what are interesting. So it's the ethnic demography, it's the sort of the ethnic balance within the different military academies. So it's Okay, so women and male attend. Okay, that's correct. We've seen that. But also who from the ethnic groups attend? So who is it always people like from the minority, or is there people from the majority that also get to attend? And so this is just a snapshot from the USMA only. This is only a table from USMA. But I think it speaks volume to some trends that are seen larger. So for instance, you can see that there's a lot of Caucasian cadets that attend, which is representative of most academies where the majority, the ethnic majority group, gets to have a really big share of the student body. There's different trends where minorities are slowly getting in, and for instance, in South Africa, where the apartheid regime had really restricted the number of people of color that could really attend. It really you saw a shift in the last 25 years. So you can really see that as time goes on, there's a shift from where it was mostly a student from the majority group, the group in power, whether or not it was a minority or a majority. And then you can see that it shifted to include more groups that were before forbidden or at least not favored in attending this institution. And so the last thing is that there's a number of systemic issues I've been pointed out in the chapters, whereas certain groups were excluded. The example of people of color in South Africa is one. In Asian countries, there were less diversities, and often this is something that military academies are pushing to include a more diverse student body for lots of reasons, both for representing their population in their military, but also for the different skills the different ethnic minority could bring to the table. So perhaps the last data I want to focus on, which is not really numbers based, but it's a few observations that I've made that I think really interesting, because now we've talked about a lot about what the college is, who attends it and what it does, but sort of where is it included in the chain that makes on one hand the path to flag officers to generals. So I was really surprised to see that none of the college that we've looked at is the staff and command college for the respective nation. So it seemed that there is a willingness to separate on an organizational level the fundamental training given to officers. So what is basically very basic trainings for sort of to make people being able to command so platoon level size units. But then when generals come back, you have the willingness to create another institution for more advanced training for career and flag officers. So that was really interesting to me, that these two institutions will never be combined. And it's also, if the military college is a part of a chain that brings people to flag officers and really general officership, it is also sort of a part of a link towards higher education. It's sort of this crossroad between military and education. And so what a trend that really emerged, and that Professor Leuprecht pointed out really early, is the presence of postgraduate education. So past the BA master program, PhD programs, often in defense studies, war studies, really defense related fields, is offered at more and more military colleges. Not all of them, but it's really a trend that we've seen up and up. And so I think, in the same sense that if you come back a centuries back, the offering a bachelor's degree was not as common. I think that as time goes on, as the profession of arms becomes more specialized, the importance of education level past the BA level to the MA and to the PhD level will really get an increased importance within military academies in general, within militaries in the broader sense. And so that brings me to the end of my short presentation on the data that we collected. There's obviously more. Financially speaking, I was not able to put forward more because it's really hard to define sort of exactly what is the budget, who are the support personnel that are often in the shadow, how many people are needed to operate the military academy. Sometimes it's restricted data, sometimes it's really hard to define, but we're really working hard to bring forward some metrics, for instance, about the cost per student to attend. So as I said in the beginning, because the student body is very small, we can posit that this is a really niche university, but is it niche? Often it's expensive. So, but is it worth it? How much more expensive is it than, for instance, sending cadets at a civilian university and sort of picking them up, if you will, for military training after the end of the university. So what is the cost difference between these two things? And so that's really one of the data points that we really want to put in the book, because it will really show how, yes, there might be change between civil and university, but what is the financial change, which is often pointed out as one of the drawbacks from having a really niche university for defense needs. And so what I want to focus on is that I think this book will be, as Professor Leuprecht pointed out, sort of an in-between between taking what has been a world for practitioners, so who trains officers for Colonel that was posted at different military academies, and sort of bringing this subject to the academia by putting together both a history and both data, but while keeping it accessible to the former. So I think that really forms a valuable vehicle to sort of to combine these two worlds and try to better understand how these institutions function and how they differ and how they can be looked at in similitude. Thank you.
Monsieur Turmel, je vous remercie. So there's a lot more in there in terms of data, but obviously there's only so much that we can unpack here. But you can already get a sense of sort of some of the benefits of having this conversation. So one of the things, for instance, that comes out of it is that all these institutions tend to be well-resourced, relatively speaking. But they also all do many other things that civilian universities don't do. And so, so while the core is sort of the cadet training, they all have other mandates and obligations beyond that. And so that, for instance, gets lost sometimes when we have purely sort of instrumental conversations about exactly how much does it cost per cadet. And so we're trying to provide sort of this broader context for the education. Monsieur Turmel also pointed out some of the civilian aspects here. So the Bundeswehr University in Hamburg, which in many ways operates very much like a civilian institution and has only a very small sort of military component. In Australia, where essentially the effort has been outsourced in terms of a contract to civilian universities to provide that education. And guess what comes out of that? In both of these universities, with both the ministry and the armed forces, some frustration about just how civilian the teaching is. And just how little or no defense component much of the teaching or the research has. So that is to say, that is not to provide a criticism of any one institution. It's simply to point out there are different ways of structuring this, and there are trade-offs involved in how you do this. In Australia, the Navy sends their people to ship for a year before they send them to before they sent them to military college. In Germany, they've decided that they're going to run the university for 3 semesters a year, and they're going to get their officer cadets, they're already officers when they go there, through in 4 years, but give them a master's degree, recognizing that in that civilian context, it's not beneficial to try to provide a lot of the military training while they're there, because of some of Germany's history and particularities of the university. So you do the military training before and after. And that has interesting ramifications for when the cadets come to us and stuff in terms of, again, pros and cons sort of involved. So I think what Monsieur Turmel sort of pointed out here is that there are similar struggles and similar challenges, but how we resolve them, there are different models available to us for how we're able to tackle those. And some clear trends in terms of for instance, the importance of graduate education that has developed, clear trends towards certification of undergraduate and graduate degrees by outside authorities. So the sense of making sure that what the military universities do is broadly recognized by governments, by ministries of education, as well as by society, in terms of the credentialing that they're doing. So there's and this across this very diverse set of countries. You can see we don't have all the data for all the countries. So this is sort of why you didn't get the full remit in all of the data, but this is something that we're working towards in revisions and me trying to get everybody to provide sort of as much of the comparable data as possible. So an opportunity to see if there's any Q&A in particular for Monsieur Turmel on what he presented. If so, then please raise your hand. And while you think about whether you want to pose a question for Monsieur Turmel, I'll do sort of the segue also to David Last, who, like Monsieur Turmel and like Howard Coombs, and unlike myself, is able to represent that civil-military tension and divide, and has been able to navigate that sort of all his life. And I think many of the most interesting and effective colleagues that I have are people who've come up in both institutional cultures and have learned to navigate both of those for considerable effect for both the cadets and for their research program. And so David has this long time interest in institutions, and has, just like I've been to probably the most obscure borders in the world, David has probably been to many of institutions that most of us have never even heard of in very far-flung countries. And I don't know anyone else who has a broader breadth of exposure to this and is able to put this in sort of a broader context of professional military education in general, and in particular pre-commissioning military university education in particular. David.
Thank you, Christian. Benny Caronto had a question, I believe, for Thomas. So perhaps you can answer that while I'm putting my slides up.
Perfect. Well, I would like to first thank Christian for that very nice project and presentation today. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Turmel, pour votre présentation qui était très intéressant. I'd like to go for a comment and a question. First comment, you seem to imply that there's a trend towards the adoption of postgraduate studies for military academies, at least we know in Europe. I'm not sure if that trend is so strong, because, for example, Austria, which used to offer an MA cadets, they dropped it a few years ago. So they get back to the BA instead. So my question on that topic here is the analysis or studies that tend to prove that officers that do get their MA at the military school are better trained and better prepared to act as officers. Is there any studies to support such an idea? My second question, in the case of Canada is quite particular, because in Canada, the military academies only train about 30% of the regular forces officers, okay? As most other countries, the military schools, they train all the officers. And even in some cases, it's divided into the elements. So you go to Army, you go to USMA, you go to Annapolis if you're in the Navy, and all of that. So in the case of Canada, the discussion is, how does the training offered at the military school differs from the one offered in the other military institutions, where the other direct entry officers, as we call them in Canada, so those that are enrolled after receiving their BA, their undergrad at civilian universities, when they join in after the military. So the debate in Canada is how to compare the two, and then comes into the metrics, the money that is put into military academies. As in other countries, all officers in Belgium, they all go to the Royal Military Academy. So you cannot compare. So second question, did you take into account in that very interesting project that you're working in, that specificity of Canada, where we only train about 30% of our officers through the military academies? Thank you.
So you can go ahead there, Professor Leuprecht.
Go ahead to mine. Then I'm happy to pick up from.
So I'll start with the second question about how do you compare civilian and military universities where there is no such thing as an officer trained in a civilian university. So yes, this is something we've tried to take account, but as you pointed out, in some cases there's simply not data. But what we found, a point of comparison to illustrate whether or not military academies actually sort of create knowledge, is something that we think that there's a difference between civilian universities and defense universities, whereas there's an emphasis on defense and security studies. So that's one of the ways we've tried to differentiate officers, and sort of the plus value brought forward by the extra cost put in in military colleges. And the other thing that another trend that we found is that at least 60% of flag officers come from military colleges where there is both a civilian and a military path to officership. And when you look at the percentage of officers coming through the military academies and the percentage of flag officers, there's a clear discrepancy. But so that opens another question. How do you explain this discrepancy? For instance, in Canada, as you said, about a third come from the military colleges, but about 65% of our flag officers come from the military college. So there's sort of that 30% gap. So where does it come from? And so maybe the question to be asked is, do more flag officers come from the military college because the education is just superior, or is it because of external reason, like sort of having the old gentleman club? So how do you explain that? So this is something we're still looking into. Professor Leuprecht, I don't know if you want to touch this question before I tackle the other.
I'll just have a couple of brief points, and then I'll let David sort of get a word in, because I know he'll have a lot to say about this as well. That so Danik, your question about method is very poignant. The challenge that I had was actually even so I didn't want institutions that were too big, with one exception. That was the United States. And I'll make a very broad brushstroke comment that I can't qualify here, but just trust that there's a lot of qualifications to that comment. But the reason I wanted to have the US included is because everybody compares themselves to the US, and it turns out nobody looks like the US. So one of the reasons why I wanted the US included is to show it's not a helpful point of comparison on any of the metrics that we go through. And we can now demonstrate that empirically. So so the hub and spoke model is that somehow we all need to look like West Point or the Air Force Academy, in many ways is less helpful than more helpful. But it is the one reference point that we have, because those are the very few places where people actually have written a little bit about what we're talking about. So this is sort of trying to have a bit of a leveling effect here with this project. And the other 9 countries were really sort of an effort with, first I collectively built sort of the method and the template, and David Last also had a key input sort of into that. And then sort of I tried to figure out, like, who are the people who might actually be able to write about this? And I have an entire folder with hundreds literally of emails of trying to bounce back and forth with people who in one way or another then decided that they can't do this, or they want to do this, but they can't get the data, or the institution won't share the data with them, or so. So in the end, this was sort of a trial by error sort of effort to try to get institutions that are not too small. And so Austria is probably sort of on the borderline. I mean, we do have Portugal sort of in the study, but sort of that are also at least somewhat comparable, and that meant sort of compromising on some of the variables. But in the introduction, we sort of, that's why this comparison that Monsieur Turmel is sort of broaching here is so important, to understand that there are important trends and commonalities, but there are also key differences. And so we need to understand, if we're going to try to compare institutions, let's understand these different models, because most people would have no idea, probably even within the institutions, whether there's a civilian training component from which the armed forces recruits, how big that is, what the result is within the institution. But it doesn't give us any traction on, well, do a higher proportion of people become generals from military colleges, which is not just a trend in Canada, it's also a trend elsewhere, because we do such a fantastic job at educating them? Or are there sort of social network effects at play where people sort of who know each other end up sort of getting promoted together? Is it that at civilian university you also build a civilian network, and so you have more options in terms of getting out? Is it perhaps that civilian universities also provide you, I mean, the military, as you know, keeps these institutions because they want to socialize people. But is it also that sort of perhaps on the civilian side, maybe some of the civilian socialization is actually very effective in terms of what we have officers do and how they function, and that it gives them sort of broader options in life? So we can actually, I wouldn't say we can actually answer all these questions, but we can now develop some hypotheses, and we can develop sort of some more informed questions that we can ask comparatively. And that might be a good segue to David on this conversation.
Thank you very much, Christian. I'd like to begin by thanking Thomas for his work and pointing out how enormously difficult it is to do what he has done. If you take each of the 10 chapters, actually I've seen 9 of them now, plus Ulrich von Hagens. If you read those chapters, you will not find it easy to produce the tables that Thomas has produced. So there's a lot of digging that produces this this broad understanding of patterns. The patterns that I'm presenting here are actually outside the data that Christian's project has generated. So this is an overview rather than a more specific reflection of the chapters in the project. And I will try and keep this to about 10 or not more than 15 minutes, so we've got a bit of time for discussion. We're finishing at 9:30. So I'll begin with asking, what are we trying to do? And then talk about professional military education in the context of entry, mid-career, and senior officer education, which is the categories that we've been using for the Global Security Education Project since about 2009. We'll also talk about the emergence of connected professional military education and a framework for empirical analysis, which is something that is work remaining to be done. And I'll finish with a question about the normative balance. What is it, coming back to the beginning question, what are we really trying to do? Who's we and what's the objective? So we as academics are trying to describe, analyze, and explain. But we as practitioners educating soldiers are trying to improve the practice of research and teaching within professional military education. But we are also members of an international community. And this is particularly true within the International Society of Military Sciences. Are we preparing warriors for expeditionary wars, for hegemonic powers in support of the neoliberal world order, which is one possibility? Are we preparing to defend national lifeboats in the rough seas of global climate change and incipient collapse? Are we trying to work across borders to solve international security problems? Are we changing the cultural focus on human security, culture, and identity? As one senior officer said recently, if you think you're in the business of preparing to fight a peer competitor, you're in the wrong business. We're actually in the business of culture change. So if that's what our senior leaders think, then that's rather a different kind of a mission than preparing for wars or preparing to manage global security. And if our focus is to be culture change in the higher education institution, are we being quixotic or irresponsible to pursue through higher education a culturally kinder and gentler military if the world around us is getting rougher? That may be something that we can afford in Canada, but I'm getting messages from people in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, that may not be something that they can afford. So what are we learning when we study our institutions of higher education, and what should we do with it? So a quick word about institutions and organizations, and I think Tamir Liebel is listening here. Institutions and organizations overlap, but they're not the same. We always introduce organizations with an organization chart, but institutions also have culture, norms, values. And one of the ways of exploring them is through explaining institutional change with historical institutional analysis. I won't go further into the methods there, but this is one of the foundations of thinking about institutions of higher education. So let's take a look at the broad international patterns. And this is from literally hundreds of data points, more than 70 countries. Generally speaking, the military is an inverse profession. Officers begin with specialization and expand their general knowledge of the profession until they're general officers with generalized knowledge. The mid-career Joint Command and Staff College is really the beginning of that generalization beyond initial specialization of branch and service. And then the focus of this study, the pre-commissioned military academies, 4 years for a degree or 10 months for officer training to go from a cadet to a lieutenant. These are the points at which early socialization in a joint environment may be an advantage, or early specialization within an environment may be a way of building better soldier, sailors, and aviators. So this is from Tamir Liebel, 2016, who's in the room. 2 ideal types of military education. And Tamir's study was actually largely at the mid-career level, although his conclusions about the evolution of national defense universities are definitely relevant to the kinds of institutions that we're looking at here. And I'll say something about that in later. So the traditional military staff college had an emphasis on professional practical training, military professional governance, military faculty, overwhelmingly national military students, a narrow military focus to the curriculum, and military training infrastructure. So you know you're looking at a traditional military school if it's got rifle ranges and obstacle courses. On the other hand, a national defense university is more likely to have libraries, journals, civilian research infrastructure. It has a security-related curriculum with a wide academic focus, a majority of national military students with some civilian and international students. A quick aside, looking at the countries in the study, Canada has one of the least internationalized campuses. Sorry, that's so ideal types of military education. The long evolution of institutions, and this is a compilation of when the institutions began, when they opened their doors. It's often difficult to trace the DNA of the current institutions back to their origin points. But we can see the growth of military education institutions primarily in the late 90s, early 21st century. And let's put this evolving professional military education in context. So a military educator and friend and colleague, Peter Foote, who was involved in setting up the Masters of Defense Studies at Canadian Forces College, and Tamir Liebel, we can consider it. So these are the categories that Peter Foote uses. The Jena model, the Falklands model, and the Kosovo model, and finally National Defense Universities. So this is Tamir's addition. And if we line these up, and this is sort of my interpretation of what I'm reading, the more uncertainty there is about the character of war, the more education to manage an unpredictable environment is privileged. Whereas the more certainty there is about the character of war, and of course there's some irony in that, because the Prussian insight after Jena is that you had to train to develop an appreciation for the uncertainty and fog of war. But this suggests that the value of experience is declining, or rather that it requires a different kind of education and preparation in order to be able to make use effectively of that experience. So the next issue that I want to talk about is the transnationalization of the profession, which and professional military education, which I've identified in a different paper. The NATO Conference of Commandants of Alliance Defense Colleges first met in 1972, but one of the characteristics of the Conference of Commandants, which is actually meeting this week in Copenhagen, is that it is largely a goldfish organization. The people who attend it only attend it once for the most part, and the majority of the participants don't remember what happened in the previous meeting and don't have an expectation about what's going to happen in the future. Not a lot of institutional memory or continuity, although the staff tries to develop that. The ASEAN Regional Forum, Heads of Defense Universities, Colleges and Institutions, has some academic hangers-on that provide a little bit more continuity. Also, the Partnership for Peace Consortium of Defense Academies and Security Institutions, 1998. And then we've got the interesting evolution, 2006, ISODOMA, later ISOMA, Symposium on the Development of Military Academies. It was initiated by the Korean Military Academy, and it meets biennially, or has met biennially since 2007, and met in the margins, or we deliberately brought the two close together in case people could attend both of them. It met in Norwich University just last week. The Central European Forum on Military Education, CEFMI, founded in 2007, and in 2008, the International Society of Military Sciences, which you're attending now. 2017, and Danick Parenteau is with us here, the International Association of Military Academies, which was established to partly, and Danick may have a comment on this, partly to prevent ISOMA from becoming like the Conference of Commandants without any continuity or cohesion over time. And so this process, largely for small countries, or rather for non-hegemonic powers, is one of the ways that the profession and its education has evolved. So we can describe this as the emergence of a transnational profession. The 6th biennial meeting of the International Symposium in Saint-Jean, 2017, 21 countries represented. Participation over time gives you an idea of the range and the global reach, if you like, of ISOMA. International Society of Military Sciences, Vienna in 2019 had 54 countries participating. And increasingly, international academic networks. ISOMA at the entry level, and ISMS representing, according to its charter, the highest level, which might imply national war colleges, national defense universities, master's and doctoral levels, but certainly institutionalized research for the generation, curation, and dissemination of military science. So this is one framework, and I provided us only an example of the sort of framework that we might be looking for, because it was written up for a journal article which was unfavorably reviewed and hasn't been published. The objection was that it sought normatively to establish the framework for security as analogous to public health, which of course really gets up the nose of realists. So the idea is that constructivism in security studies, a realist sociology of knowledge, and institutionalism in political science help us provide a series of lenses to understand what is taught in security education, how knowledge is institutionalized, and therefore what we choose to do with it. And I'm almost done here, but it allows us to think about a balance, a normative balance and let's just paint it starkly for sake of argument. A grim balance, life is bleak and getting worse. Tad Homer-Dixon's opening presentation. The world's going to hell in a handcart. Security dilemmas rule. Major power confrontations inevitable. Smaller countries like most of ISMS members really don't have a lot of agency, and intra and intrastate conflict is going to be dirty, continuous, and often below the threshold. So if you've participated in Working Group 1's series of papers, you will have seen a lot of this. And in this scenario, we have to throw people out of the lifeboat in order to survive. We have to focus on national security, or we're really missing the big picture. Alternatively, and this is the other scenario, cooperation can be constructed. Collective security is possible. New technologies favor small states. The recent Nagorno-Karabakh war illustrates that all is not lost if you don't have aircraft carriers. All big powers are bad, but all big powers are also remediable and subject to influence. Capitalism is the only remaining system, but we have to reform markets or it's going to be the end of us. And a focus on human and international security is essential, or we miss the big picture of what's going to lead to our security. So these are the kinds of these alternative worldviews, alternative scenarios, if you like, fit in very well with what Homer-Dixon calls WITS, worldviews, institutions, and technologies. So to conclude, and I'm a minute or two over what I had hoped for, what are we trying to do? I think as teachers, as researchers in security education institutions, all of us are pretty firmly fixed on saving the world, but trying to be realistic about it. Entry-level PME exists as part of a larger PME institution. That PME institution is increasingly transnationally connected. Whether it's global or competitive within alliance systems is something that is being constructed now by the way that we deal with our students. The framework that I suggested, and it's only one framework, those three lenses give us ways of thinking about professional military education. And the bottom line, I think at this stage in our collective human journey, heaven is clearly out of reach, but we might be able to avoid hell if we work hard. And I will stop there.
So this will be a good opportunity to circle back to Danik and to other colleagues who are with us here today on comments and input into what you've heard, as well as any interest in getting in on the study if you're from a country that's not represented, but you think you might want to expand and pitch in.
Christian, if I may. Thank you, David, for a very interesting presentation. With regard to ISOMA, I would say you characterize the two organizations, ISOMA and ISMS, as complementary to one another, which is exactly that. I would only add, ISOMA is trying to build an expertise on research, which has been a bit weak so far. We've seen in the last ISOMA edition in Norwich last week an effort for a real presentation, doing real research, as the ISOMA so far has been mostly focusing on an exchange between military academies that does not only involve academics. So it was also a discussion regarding the military training, physical training, and all that. So I see a very, very good complementary between the two organizations. I'm very proud to be part of both organizations now. And I see that we should be working to get together so we can complement one another.
So along those lines, Danik, we have invited you and the current host, Travis Morris, to the business meetings tomorrow. There are some interesting institutional differences between ISOMA and ISMS. which we may want to discuss tomorrow. But the idea that there is a transnational linkage of institutions involved in professional military education, with many institutions that have similar problems, although perhaps different objectives. Because in that last scenario slide, Canada looks a lot more like the right-hand light slide, but if you're living in Ukraine, it looks a little bit more like the black slide on the left. Neighborhoods make a difference. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the two organizations will provide complementary ways of sharing information between institutions. Stefan.
Yeah, I think that Swedish Defence University could give you some information of our education and the percentage of women and all that without too much work. If you have a questionnaire, you could mail it to me. Maybe it's of interest.
Stefan, I would love to take you up on this. So I've had conversation with Eric Hedlund, and I think Eric would be happy to help and support on that project. But he wasn't sure whether he can get it all the data. So perhaps between yourself and Eric, there might be an opportunity that because Sweden would be excellent, because I think in many ways Sweden is so comparable to Canada, for instance, in a lot of what we do. So that would be so I'll touch base with you. That's a very helpful intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Tamir, did I see you with a question, or was that?
Hi, I can probably also try to help a little with the analysis about the Swedish Defence University.
I'm sorry, you've got a bit of an echo there. I think you said you can help with data about Swedish Defence University?
With the analysis.
Analysis, super. Thank you. I have a couple of other notes in comparison, but I see we have only 2 minutes left. Christian, I think it's, I had the role as discussant. I think I've used that time. Christian, back to you as the chair.
So I'm happy to wrap it up, but want to make sure that I give both you and Tuma an opportunity just to, I guess, in 30 to 60 seconds, provide some concluding remarks on sort of to the session here. Tuma, did you want to weigh in first?
Yeah, that's fine. I think just to wrap up my presentation, I think it was interesting to bring numbers to the table where we usually look at it heuristically, sort of looking at the history and the sort of words rather than numbers. But I'm really looking forward to assembling all the data in the book, and I think that would be really interesting to see. Thank you.
I think there's one theme that we haven't addressed, lots of themes we haven't, but one that I had prominently that hasn't come up, and that is that there is across many external studies of military colleges, entry-level military academies, a criticism of teenage romanticism, a uniform-focused teenage military romanticism with red coats or agulas negras or the long gray line, which may isolate and may not be entirely functional. And that should be contrasted with the positive social role of socializing and managing young male aggression. So those two different images of romantic militarism versus socially managed masculine aggression are themes that I haven't seen in the chapters that we've reviewed, but which are part of the sort of independent national discourses in many of the contributing countries. And that is something that's unique at the entry level. We don't see it to the same extent in the mid-career or senior officer. So that would be the only other thing that I might mention.
And I thank all the participants. I thank Howard Coombs, Thomas Jomel, and David Last for their contributions, and David Last for his Herculean effort in pulling together ISMS this year. And on top of that, doing it virtually and so flawlessly. So my appreciation to you for making this panel possible.